All right, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry to interrupt again. I'm so delighted to be welcoming Dr. Trent Walker to give today's Gatty talk. Trent is currently postdoctoral fellow at the Ho Center of Buddhist Studies and a lecturer in religious studies at Stanford University. He is an inspirational scholar of Cambodian Buddhism in particular. He has been called, I think, very justifiably, the leader of a new generation of scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism. I think for good reason. He works with sources as diverse as temple inscriptions and cassette tapes to just present Buddhism in a new light, a way that I think is both accessible, scholarly, rigorous, and just really wonderful to read and experience. We're so lucky to hear his thoughts here today. Most importantly, he is a very genuine and generous scholar, human and friend, and as sort of a token of that generosity, he's kindly giving up a lot of his time tomorrow to run a workshop for those of us who are here in Ithaca on Southeast Asian manuscripts in our own collections here. So for anyone who is around between 1:30 and 4:30 tomorrow, or I believe any section of that time, please do join us at the library. There are probably very detailed instructions and times and dates somewhere online that I don't know where, but join us there. And for now, please join me in welcoming Trent to give today's talk.
Thank you so much for that. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure. And hello to all of you on Zoom and watching this later. My apologies that I won't be looking at you unless you have questions during the Q&A. So one reason why it's a particular pleasure to be here is that my parents actually met not too far from here, and I wouldn't be here in the world if they had not met. My dad, I think, was the president of Sigma Nu, or no, as it turns out, and my mom was a student at Cuca College. And so growing up, I always had this picture, even though I grew up in California, of Cornell as this exemplar among universities. So it's a real privilege for me to be here, and something that I can say that among the many things that I'm not sure that make my parents proud, certainly coming here is something that that they will celebrate. So thank you for that. My talk today is, if you'll indulge me, will just be me speaking. I have no slides. If you're interested in images of the kinds of manuscripts, of the kinds of rituals that they entail, and the chanting teachers who I'll be invoking in this presentation, I invite you to check out my website. I have images, multimedia that connects to some of the themes. But in this opportunity to give a talk in person, I just wanted to connect as much as I could with those of you who are here in this room and who might be watching this talk later on. So please forgive me for that. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and your engagement. I think I'm also, like all of us, thinking about what does it mean to give a talk? What does it mean to do academic research in this age of the rise of AI? Knowing that this is being recorded, this will be on YouTube, this will eventually be digested by various algorithms, by various large-scale databases that computers are reading. What does it mean that everything that we say and do in a space like this is somehow not just living on within our own control, but in some ways it's completely beyond our control? So for better or for worse, that's I think always something at stake when we're producing and sharing knowledge in this day and age. And to that, I'm really wondering in my own scholarship, what can we do that attunes to the human? What can we do that connects to our experiences or perspectives as human beings as we learn and share and discover anew with one another? So let that just be a way of framing of how I'm trying to think through the material today. As you know, what I'm offering this afternoon is a book talk of sorts from this book, Until Nirvana's Time, Buddhist Songs of Cambodia, that just came out. I have a few extra copies of it. A number of Cambodian American donors in particular have been very generous in supporting the free distribution of this book to Cambodian American communities. So if any of you, I only have a few copies left now, but if would like the book, please come up to me afterward. I'm delighted to give that to you, particularly if you're a student. Without further ado, let me begin. Buddhist poetry has long informed and also inspired what Buddhists do. So we might think of the ancient verses attributed to the Buddha's early disciples, or the kinds of pithy poems of medieval Zen monastics, or even the ecstatic songs penned by Indian and Tibetan yogis. Buddhists in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia have likewise long expressed their insights and their aspirations in verse. Yet, as you're well aware, very little vernacular Theravada poetry has appeared in English translation. Rarely are the works of, say, Burmese and Thai Buddhist poets, it's a little bit better situation for singular Buddhist poets, available to Anglophone readers. Cambodian Buddhist poems are even harder to find, and their works are in some ways little known outside of Khmer or Khmer-speaking communities in Southeast Asia and in the global diaspora. My book seeks to change that. If it does one simple thing, it seeks to change that by centering the voices of Cambodian poets from the 17th to early 20th century. For the past 700 years, most Cambodians, not all, but most, have practiced forms of what we would now recognize as Theravada Buddhism, and their Khmer language poetry reflects a deep intimacy with both Indic Buddhist traditions and their Southeast Asian reimaginations. And the largely anonymous authors that I translate have produced what I would consider a very rich body of work, by turns frank, devout, and radiant. The 45 poems translated in my book are Dharma songs, or poabot in Khmer. These are texts meant to be recited with complex melodies known as smol. I first came to the Cambodian Dharma song tradition as a student in its modern lineage of vocal performance. And studying under the chanting masters Brumut, Gauran, and Yamburan in Cambodia in 2005 and 2006, I ended up memorizing a significant repertoire of Dharma songs long before my literary Khmer was advanced to kind of attempt translating them into English. And that means that some of the translations in the book I've been working on and off for about 15 years. Others I only came across as texts in 2016 and 2017, when I spent another couple of years in Cambodia doing dissertation research, and this time immersed in the study of traditional manuscripts rather than music. None of the poems have appeared in book form in English, with the exception that a couple have come out in this anthology of Cambodian literature I co-edited. But other than that, they haven't yet appeared in book form. A quarter of them have never been published in Khmer either, so only been transmitted in oral lineages or on palm leaf or bark paper manuscripts. And indeed, this combination of oral and written transmission is common for Cambodian Buddhist poems. Khmer poetry is traditionally chanted aloud in dozens of different melodies. And some of these melodies are fast-paced and may only use a few musical pitches, like this one. Others, however, are slow. They're highly ornamented and require a wide vocal range to reach all of their many notes. So here's another example of this much more melismatic style. most of the Dharma songs translated in this book are intended to be recited with such elaborate and elongated styles. And some of them are actually short enough to memorize with an average number of stanzas of about 30 each. Yet in this style, a single stanza can take up to 3 minutes to recite, or a whole poem, maybe 3 hours or so. And as these songs are traditionally performed at night, they take center stage at dusk-to-dawn rites of healing, mourning, dedication, and remembrance. And so the slow pace, the complex melodies, and of course the ritual context of these works are always on my mind as a translator. Each word of the Khmer, as it were, is designed to linger in the air, carried by breath and music. So in my view, as readers and as listeners, we must be patient in a certain sense, letting the meaning gradually reveal itself to us. Some of the poems are relatively close to modern Khmer. Others have flashes of the archaic and pose a tangle of knots and kinds of philological riddles. But in the long history of Buddhist literature across Asia, these are relative newcomers. And they're part of a tradition that's nourished by Cambodians today. They're written to be accessible, to speak broadly and clearly of the human condition. I selected these particular poems from hundreds of possible works in order to represent the highlights of the Cambodian Dharma song tradition. So in that sense, most of the most popular songs are included, as well as others that I found to be of exceptional academic interest or literary merit. And in so doing, I tried to make sure that all of the major genres are covered. That is the life of the Buddha, gratitude to parents, the impermanence of the body, and aspiration for Nirvana. And so I've organized the translations in the book, and then also this talk into 4 cycles that follow these themes: narrating lives, repaying debts, befriending death, and chasing peace. So let me take you through each of these cycles, and I'll make some contextual comments along the way. Cycle 1, narrating lives. The Buddha's journey to awakening was not a solo venture. In his last life as Siddhartha Gautama, and in countless births before that, tradition holds that he traveled through samsara, through this cycle of birth and death, with a familiar cast of characters, living beings who eventually became his wife, his mother, his aunt, his father, cousin, son, attendant, arch enemy, and leading monastic disciples, among many others. And Cambodian retellings of his numberless lives embed the Buddha in these relationships. That is exactly how the Buddha is framed, not just as a kind of hero's journey taking place with one person moving forward to this particular religious goal, but one in which the Buddha is embedded in these relationships. And one, I think, in which these kinds of emotional bonds of love, of loss, reverberate longer than specific deeds. And the songs in this cycle retrace these kinds of affective ties over time, combining into a sweeping narrative arc. The first 6 poems recount some of the various past life narratives of the Buddha, which are known as Jataka narratives in Pali. Once a mighty elephant, once the son of a blind couple, this is in the Suvarna Sama Jataka, once a banished prince, this is in the Vasantara Jataka. The next 6 lives narrate his final life as Siddhartha, from birth into the beginning of his teaching career. And the final 6 are really focused around the passing away, the responses to the Buddha's disciples and family to his passing away, and then, of course, the distribution and veneration of his relics. Many of the poems gathered in this particular section are laments. In some Khmer dialects, particularly those spoken in Surin and Sisaket and Buriram provinces of Thailand, the verb tuing is sometimes, which usually means to lament, is used as a synonym for smol, is used as a synonym for reciting Dharma songs. So there's a way in which these genres terms can collapse around this idea of lamentation. And in that sense, that's why we hear the cries of the Buddha, his children, his mother, his wife across various lives. We have the grief of Ananda, his attendant, and of many other followers. So one text here in this section is one that was once commonly used in sermon versions of the Vasantra Jataka, what's known in Khmer as the Mahakyat or Mahatra in Thai, the great birth. And in the retellings in Cambodia of the Vasantra Jataka, certain episodes are set aside for melodic recitation, typically in the vernacular. And one of those episodes is this moment where the Buddha-to-be, the Bodhisattva, having given away his children to Jujaka, this Brahmin who is demanding these children in order to appease his much younger wife. The two children are being terribly abused by Jujaka, and two deities come down at night, taking the form of Vasantra and his wife Mandri, or Mandi in Pali, to soothe the children. And it's this lullaby that's brought out. So even though in any given performance, maybe not all of the context of the story would be given, because that, of course, would be intimately known by Cambodian audiences, particularly at the time of the composition of this, probably 18th or 19th century. But this one moment is brought out of the gods offering this lullaby to the terrified children. And in my translations, I try to create ways that they can be recited in both English and Khmer, following the same metrical patterns. So I'll just recite one stanza in each language of this poem. Giờ Krishna ao Krishna giờ Krishna mình bọc cao na công nhung đại nam ai bóp phê oh are you crowing near our heart? Hey Krishna, oh Krishna, hey Krishna. My dearest child, don't you cry. Mama's here, singing you to sleep. Other poems in this section move forward from these Jataka tales of the past lives of the Buddha to his final life. And as I mentioned, a number of them are centered around the passing away of the Buddha into Nirvana. And one of these texts, known in Pali as Pratsvabhuvajana, or the last words of the Buddha, recounts this particular moment of an interaction between the Buddha and Ananda. Ananda at this point is grieving the loss of the Buddha, having yet to reach awakening, and the Buddha tries to comfort Ananda in this moment. And I'll recite, just so you have a sense of this, again, a stanza in Khmer, and then I'll move forward in reading it in English. Yo ตถาคตนังโมตัสสะจากเจ้ามันหัง Yo, wo, Ananda. I'm here now. Don't delay. I'll soon pass away, leaving you all alone. Oh, friend, please be well. Don't suffer needlessly, for I must leave you. Don't you grieve, Ananda. My 5 aggregates will break down and dissolve. Stay, stay, Ananda. Contemplate your own life. These days, your body is brittle as fired clay. It won't last for long. Bound to break in pieces. Please, dear Ananda, contemplate this deeply. When I pass away, you must bear my teaching. Truly, this karma remains with anyone whose heart is bright and clear, who follows what I teach. Now the realized one shall end in Nirvana. Times comes cruel to crush and cut off. At least 60 different melodies, plus a range of variations may be used to perform Khmer poetry. Each meter has a set of melodies that are proper to it. The melodies in general are tied to particular meters and may not be freely applied across different kinds of compositions. And in some older performance styles, including that taught to me by my first teacher, who lived from 1945 to 2009, the melody varies slightly from stanza to stanza, allowing the musical emphasis to fall on different words. So, for instance, in that last text, normally the melody would repeat each stanza, but he would recite the first stanza, the first 2 notes of the stanza, like yo, wa. But then for the next stanza, he would elaborate it slightly. Yo, ba. And then by the time he got to the third stanza, it would take on its full form. In the book, I include the melody names of each of these kinds of melodies that are used to perform each text, if known. And this is following the conventions of my teacher, Yamburen, and his colleagues for naming all of these different recitation styles in Khmer. The melodic aspects of Khmer songs, for me, really shape both how they were composed and also serve as a key link between the text and the emotional impact that they are intended to have on listeners. And it's this affective dimension of Dharma song melodies include what we might refer to as the emotional responses of, in Pali or Sanskrit is known as samvega and pasada. So Cambodian Buddhists frequently articulate, including my teacher, Gao, she told me that the purpose, in her view, of reciting Dharma songs is either to rouse or frighten the audience through this generating this experience of samvega in Pali, or to calm or gladden them through this experience of saparayatva or vasada, the sense of stilling in Pali. And particular kinds of melodies are associated with one kind of aesthetic experience or the other. Each of these kinds of melodies might feature similar vocal techniques, so long phrases, intricate vocal ornamentation, register breaks, extended melismatic passages in which single syllables are stretched out over many notes. But the key difference between the ones that are intended to evoke samvega, the sense of being stirred, and pasada, the sense of being stilled, lies in their musical modes or scales. So to take for a moment the language of Western musical theory, those that are selected for samvega kinds of eliciting texts use these 5, 6, or 7 note scales, usually with a minor third, a major third, sometimes both. And if we take like C as a fundamental pitch, we would get scale something like C, E, F, G, B flat, something like that, or occasionally with both the major and minor third together. C, E flat, E, F, G, B flat, these kinds of scales, which is, according to Cambodian ethnomusicologist Kim Soki, the most distinctive and fundamental mode in Cambodian music. Pasada invoking texts, on the other hand, use an alternative set of scales, and the most common among them is a simple kind of major pentatonic scale, something like C, D, E, G, A, and these are only approximations. Khmer music doesn't follow Western tuning systems exactly, but this is just to give you idea, kind of convenient basis for understanding the divergent ways that emotions might be intended to be communicated through different Dharma song melodies. Cycle 2, repaying debts. Khmer texts hold that we come into this world already in debt in some sense. To the parents who birthed us, to those who raised us, the sun, the earth, all that sustains us. And the tradition asks, who are we without our families? Who are we without our teachers? Who are we without the natural world? And the Khmer term for engaging these kinds of debts is kun. This is perhaps the central doctrinal notion of early modern Cambodian Buddhism. Kun here is the Khmer form of the Pali and Sanskrit word guna. In most Indic contexts, guna means something like constituent part or quality, and by extension, good quality or even virtue. This term is actually quite rare in the Tipitaka and the Pali Canon, but it surfaces extensively in the commentarial literature of the Buddhist tradition, particularly in this sense of virtue. So in that sense, the Arthakatha literature, the commentary literature in Theravada Buddhism frequently invokes a term like Buddha Guna, to refer to the perfected qualities of the Buddha. This sense of gun is primary in Khmer, but it's also accompanied by this secondary sense of a debt of gratitude. So the gun of our parents refers to their virtues and also the debts that we as children owe them. And this is a similar kind of formulation to ideas around recognizing and knowing debts in other kinds of Southeast Asian languages. So certainly phrases like dong kun in Khmer or katanyuta in Pali, to know or to know this debt of gratitude, to recognize it. In a Thai perspective, or in a Vietnamese perspective, are all very common formulations of how to understand this act of knowing as an expression of gratitude. And so texts in this cycle often detail in very extensive ways the many ways that parents, particularly mothers, as well as fathers, teachers, and others, make sacrifices to care and raise children and students. There are also texts in this section that go into the debts that human beings are understood to have to the natural world. But just to take an example of, here, this is a long text known as Uliaba, or absolving all faults. And this is a long litany of repentance. But the very beginning of it, as a part of this life review of repentance that imagines all the ways in some kind of normal human life in 18th century Cambodia, one might cause harm to others, harms that one needs to seek repentance for, but might be completely inevitable, such as all the harms that one might do to one's mother while in the womb or in infancy, etc. And so this text begins in this way. One day, nhom tua là ba tí bằng com hét đây I place my head beneath your feet, my 10 fingers raised high above in veneration, 3 jewels. May I take leave of my own faults from conception up to the present. While pregnant with me, my mother's sinews went slack, her body racked with stabs and pangs. Fearing sprites would torment her, she bore a long, heavy burden and constant pain. And so texts like this continue through the long process of gestation, of childbirth, of raising an infant, all the way up to all the other kinds of ways that human beings perhaps inevitably might be causing harm to one another. Traditional Khmer texts on meditative practices draw on esoteric systems that were widely practiced by Theravada Buddhists, particularly prior to the 20th century. And according to these systems, the kun of various entities can be expressed as heart syllables. These are known as bando in Khmer, means something like the pith of a tree, or huachai in Thai. And these syllables, drawn from the vowels and the consonants of Khmer script, have the ability to encapsulate a range of specific guna. Intoned as mantras, inscribed in magical diagrams. This is yantra or yuan in Khmer, or tattooed on the body. These heart letters have the power in this tradition to take on the particular kun that they represent. And perhaps the most important nexus of this idea of kun and heart syllables in traditional Cambodian Buddhism concerns the 33 parts of the body. So according to this anatomical list in Cambodian sources, sometimes we often say in Thai or Lao sources, a 32-item list is preferred instead. But in Khmer sources, often we see this 33-item list. It's inspired by canonical meditation practices. We see that 12 parts of the body are considered liquid elements and connected to the gun of our mothers. And then each of these 12 parts is likewise associated with a different letter in the 33 consonants of the Khmer alphabet. And the remaining consonants might be paired to the 21 solid parts of the body, which are linked to the gun, or to the legacy in this sense of our fathers. To repay debts to parents in the system, one is supposed to know in some very intimate way the inside and the outside of this body that they have bequeathed to us. And the way that these parts can be encapsulated in 33 heart syllables that embody specific gun. So there are a number of texts that are chants in this book that go through enumerating these in a very detailed way, this kind of debt to parents. Cycle 3, befriending death. Fleeting. Painful. Not yours. These in the Khmer tradition are the 3 marks, in Bali the ilakna, the facts that haunt our lives from a Buddhist perspective. So from the perspective of these texts, born in this kind of human body, all of us must sooner or later grapple with these kinds of realities, that the body is limited, it's destined to suffer in some way, and doesn't belong to us in the end. So in this cycle, the Dharma songs are really trying to find different ways to articulate or work through this message. And here, the poems are really intended to be recited for the dying. In some cases for the dead, or also for the bereaved. And that's because the tradition holds that only when death is near, in some sense, near to us or near to those whom we love, that the 3 marks become legible in some way. And so the songs are trying to awaken or elicit this kind of sense of spiritual urgency. This samvega as the end of life draws near. Deathbed rites, particularly in rural contexts in contemporary Cambodia, and also as described in the kinds of manuscripts I've been working on in this project, they're generally only conducted for those who have reached an advanced age and are suffering from a kind of terminal illness. In other words, they've given up hope of some kind of medical intervention. In this case, ideally, the dying person is at home in a clean or a freshly painted or wallpapered room. Woven tapestries or painted banners of the Buddha, these are known as pratmot and Khmer, prabot and Thai, these kinds of banner paintings that can be moved around from the monastery to the home and back again, might be hung from the walls or suspended from the ceiling. A small Buddha image is usually placed near the head of the patient with a modest altar, maybe adorned with flowers, incense, or other kinds of offerings. And this is meant to be visible to the dying person, but also easily accessible to family members. Then a space is prepared for monks, nuns, and today actually most often lay people, particularly lay women, to chant Buddhist texts or these Dharma songs, often every evening during a long period of these kinds of rituals, from perhaps the early evening until sunrise. And let me give you just a couple examples of songs that might be recited in this context. So the first one here is called This Life is Short, or and just to give you the first stanza in Khmer, it goes something like this. Mình tiếng tê cạp mọc chia nung tung dương kê mình đã tung đi sẵn cát tục. This life is short. You are born with body form that can last. You'll never be free or get past the shadow cast by distress. Nothing is yours, all is void, all is devoid of essence. No fame, no rank, no parents, no one precious, nobody, not even those born before, not even your family. Your own body is empty. Listen to me, make this known. Discarded deep in the forest with none to trust as your own, save wild beasts who grunt and groan. You'll be alone through and through. Your wealth, your worst poverty. You can't take anything with you. You'll lie there, nothing to do. Your body truly worthless. All merit gone in your wake, your kin will take your carcass to woodlands cloaked in darkness. They'll leave tearless. There you'll stay. The dead must be abandoned, their bones and flesh thrown away, their bodies bound to decay, their name, they say, soon unsaid. Reflect on this and be stirred. Don't be deterred, but instead take refuge in what's well said. Hear this and tread the right course. Give gifts, keep rules, train your heart. 3 ways to start from the source. To wipe your brow of remorse, don't do what's coarse. Thus I preach, build your merit, guard your mind, always be kind. Strive to reach all those in need. Make your speech match those who teach the true path. And here the rhyme pattern in the English is matching exactly what's happening in the Khmer in this particular walk complete with this 7-syllable meter, which is quite parallel to various glon meters in Thai. In terms of where these songs come from and how they've been passed down in oral traditions and written documents, I think there are a number of areas we could explore there. First of all, sort of despite the importance of Pali, both lexically and liturgically in Cambodian Buddhist settings, as is the case in neighboring areas of the Theravada world, very few Cambodian writers over the centuries composed exclusively in Pali. Most authors preferred to write either in bilingual Pali Khmer prose or in a monolingual Khmer verse. This is in Buddhist settings in particular. And so before the mid-20th century, the former, this bilingual Pali Khmer prose, was primarily used for doctrinal texts, also for public sermons, and the latter, that is Khmer verse, was used for a variety of didactic poems, epic narratives, ritual chants. And prior to the adoption of print technology in the early 1900s in Cambodia, both Pali Khmer prose and Khmer verse texts were recorded on a number of different traditional manuscript formats. Some of you may be joining the workshop tomorrow. We'll get to see and interact with some of those formats as they were used in Cambodia and other parts of mainland Southeast Asia. But essentially those on incised palm leaves, as well as those made from various forms of accordion folded bark pulp paper. On the other hand, a number of texts were short enough to be learned by heart and therefore could be passed down through oral tradition. And sort of, in my view, neither the written or the oral dimensions can we neglect in the study of these kinds of texts. Some of the most talented reciters, and indeed one of my key teachers of this genre, are blind or illiterate, and committed a very impressive repertoire of these songs to memory that they're able to then perform at all the different places they might be asked to recite. Other performers, like for instance, my first teacher would use books or manuscripts, but usually as kind of tools for learning or sometimes memory aids during recitation. Most performers learn these kinds of vocal techniques under the tutelage of a lay or monastic teacher, though today in Cambodia and also in the diaspora, it's becoming more common to learn from audio recordings. There's no recognized musical notation system that's used in Cambodia traditionally, as is the case in most of mainland Southeast Asia. So students of Dharma songs can't rely on visual cues, but instead have to learn these melodies and the vocal ornamentations through a long process of listening, imitation, and correction. Then, in terms of the written transmission, most of what I ended up exploring in my dissertation work, which was based on the study of around 70 of these leporello or bark pulp paper manuscripts in Cambodia, there I was interested in the written dimension of the tradition. So these manuscripts contain about 653 texts, and 195 distinct compositions that I edited for the purposes of the dissertation. The book selects from some of those and also brings in some that were only passed down in an oral context. In both cases involve a process of editing, and in other words, comparing different manuscripts, because in the process of transmission, there are many textual variants that have proliferated. Also, no standardized orthography was used prior to the early 20th century in Cambodia. So part of the work in engaging these poems prior to translation was trying to establish editions of them that could be translated. For those who read Khmer, all of those editions and also digital images of all the leporello manuscripts are all freely available on my website. I regret that it wasn't able to be part of the book to make it bilingual, but it is available online in that form. Let me turn now to the last cycle, cycle 4, chasing peace. And this cycle engages really as its central image that of the Buddha, of the Buddhist relics, of the consecration of Buddha images, of worship of the symbols on the soles of Buddha's feet, all kinds of texts that are about expressing both a still Asada-like confidence in the Buddha, and certainly the melodies and the rhythmic structures of the text support that use of them, as well as certain kinds of religious aspirations. And we might think of these aspirations as falling into two broad categories. One, the normal soteriological aspiration that we would expect in a Theravada Buddhist context, that of aspiration for arhatship or nirvana, liberation within the cycle to escape the cycle of samsara. And then secondly, this goal to become fully awakened, omniscient Buddha, which is the soteriological goal that appears less frequently in Theravada contexts, more frequently in Mahayana ones, but was particularly important in the 16th to 19th centuries, not just in Cambodia, also in Thailand and Laos as well. And so let me leave you here with just a couple of songs from this cycle to give you a sense, both melodically and also in the text, how they are constructing these particular aspirations. One thing to bear in mind here is that the cycles that I chose are based on the way that these texts are sequenced in manuscripts, based on the way the text might be performed today over the course of a multi-day ritual. Also, in some senses, based on the way that when these texts do appear in the written tradition of Karma songs today, these are examples of various books in which these texts might perform, the ways that they might be developed liturgically into different groups. And here part of the logic is at the conclusion of a long multi-day rite in which there is first a period of healing or of also end of life rites as one transitions from life to death. Then a long funeral ceremony. At the conclusion of funeral ceremonies, there might be a Buddha image consecration ceremony, this kind of ritual to take a stone or a wood or a metal image and make it alive in some sense within the context of the Cambodian tradition. So one such text that we recited here is one that's usually referred to as Motum Twaika, or lotus flower offering. This is one that's used with this kind of aspiration to reach Nirvana. And one melody for it goes something like this. Our hearts brim with joy, clear faith overflowing. We've come to offer flowers to the teacher. May we earn the boons that lead us from rebirth and the heat of strife to the Lord's cool refuge. We take these blossoms, weave them into garlands, fragrant rings and wreaths, and give them to the Lord, to his teachings and his community, to the triple gem crowned with the three worlds. Here, we're all bereaved, worn out, Vida, broken, quarreled by worldly life, sundered from our spouses. We're bound to suffer in rounds of birth and death. No one can help us. Ours alone, the anguish. We offer these flowers to you, Lord, so that we might from fault be freed and break the grip of age, flee the pit of pain, leave death in the dust, and one day delight in Nirvana's repose. May our prayers fly straight, made true by honesty. Real bliss, may it come for us all, step by step. And in other cases, the poem recited in this particular context, this is at dawn, at the conclusion of the Buddha image consecration ceremony, might articulate an aspiration for complete awakening as a Buddha. A slightly different melody might be used, something like Ma Tom Ma. And here the aspirations would begin with this offering of lotus flowers to the image, describing the beauty of the sculpted image, but then leading to a series of vows that become progressively more lofty. And here they're corresponding to this idea that the core religious aspiration of this period is to seek to become a fully awakened Buddha, to bring liberation to other sentient beings. with phrases like, may I be kind toward all creatures, giving them gifts with firm resolve, without any hesitation, just like great Prince Vasantara. Should some commit capital crimes or be condemned to endless pain, may I free them from such rulings so that they may regain their lives. May I exchange my life for theirs, just like our Buddhas have resolved. May I serve as the guarantor for all creatures, their last refuge. The 4 cycles in Eternal Nirvana's time are intended to, again, cover this broad range of Buddhist rituals. Some were composed with specific rites in mind, whether it's for the annual celebration of the Buddha's birth and awakening and passing away, known as Visakhabodhi or Vesak. Others could be used across the range of different ceremonies. And that could include these end-of-life rites, funerals, or the kinds of Buddha image consecration ceremonies that are often at the conclusion of the most elaborate rites. And all of these are also a kind of snapshot of a ritual tradition that's in motion. And in translating and working through these texts, I think something that I'm continuing to struggle with, to think through more, is to what to make to the specific early modern approaches they offer to these themes of love and loss, of devotion and contemplation, of consecration and healing. How do we situate them within their particular historical time, as well as the ways they continue to be relevant for Khmer communities in Cambodia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia and in global diaspora. So with that, I want to open the floor up for questions. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry to go over time. And those of you who are here on Zoom, thank you so much for your attention as well. You can ask questions. I believe that Harry will be able to assist in bringing those questions to my attention as well. Yes, please go ahead, Atan.
I think you describe how this happens. You say this is part of the Buddhist Nirvana ceremony.
Yes.
So we must have monks there too. But the chanters are not necessarily monks, right?
Absolutely.
Can you just describe the setting and how this all fits together?
Sure. So imagine a wake after a funeral. So someone has died, their body is either brought to the temple near the crematorium, or they're at home. During this period, monastics, usually male monks in this context, would be invited to recite certain texts in Pali. These are most commonly excerpts from the Abhidhamma that are used specifically for a funeral ceremony. Same kind of pattern we see in Cambodia and in Laos. At that time in Cambodia, after the monks have finished the recitation of these texts in Pali, lay people might be then invited to sit near the body, to sit near the gathered mourners who are present, and then continue reciting often these vernacular language, Khmer language texts, sometimes just for a few hours in the evening, sometimes all night long. In certain contexts in Cambodia today, when a live performer is not available, recordings are used instead. And so the sonic sort of sign that a Cambodian funeral is taking place, whether in the city, well, this has decreased somewhat in recent years, but certainly in the countryside, are loudspeakers that are broadcasting this kind of chanting. So everyone knows that if they hear this form, they know that, someone has passed away, a funeral is taking place there. I hope that captures a little bit of the scene. Thank you.
We've got one on Zoom, but we can also take from here as well.
I don't see anyone here yet. Oh, yes, please go for it. Yes, and then we'll go to Zoom. Yeah.
So are there like any forms of like poem recitations or performances that are more secular, but do not completely depart from like the Buddhist like religiosity? Because in the northern part of Thailand, like there are performances which are called cow, not cow with the rice, but cow with a cow pie.
Yeah.
Like egg roll and yeah, that one. Those like songs are written in Lana Dharmic scripts.
Yes.
But many of them are for like entertaining like purposes though. So are there like any other performances of like that poems that are more like towards it that way?
Absolutely. So as you certainly well know, in a different parts of Thailand, also in Laos, there are a variety of texts that are written in verse and that are not necessarily considered fit to be recited inside of the bowl, inside of the Vihia in Cambodia, inside of the most sacred part of the temple, but can be recited outside of that, often at temple festivals, can be recited by lay people or sometimes by monastics. So the same is true in Cambodia. So for instance, I'm less familiar with this cow genre in Lana, but in the central Thai context, what was formerly we recited these kinds of there's a wonderful book about these kind of texts and how they would have been recited between the 18th and the 19th century, are a similar genre of texts that might be drawn from the Panyasa Jataka, might be drawn from other kinds of local narratives, are not strictly sacred texts in terms of what might be recited within the sacred part of the temple, but are nonetheless poetic texts recited with elaborate kinds of melodies, what would be known, for instance, in Laos as the An Nang Sui, kinds of that way of reading. Even a text like San Sing Sai in Laos is part of the same kind of genre. So in the Khmer context, that same parallel text, Songs of the this text drawn from the Panyasa Jataka, that's a long, wild, wonderful, romantic, adventurous narrative that it's framed as a Buddhist text, but isn't really strictly one, would be recited in similar kinds of styles. In order to have it fit within the parameters of time and not to completely bore the audience, faster recitation styles are used in that case, not the very slow ones used here. But, and again, similar kinds of ways that we see this happening across many studies. I'm sorry, I haven't been repeating the questions on Zoom, but so my apologies for that. But question here. Oh, this is yep. So,
yeah, I can read it out.
Please, thank you. This is hard for me to. Thank you.
Are there distinct regional traditions of Cambodian Dharma songs in terms of either content or performative style? And if how, if at all, have the sonic or performative aesthetics of Cambodian Dharma songs changed over the course of the past century?
Wonderful. Thanks so much for this question. So I would love to understand more about the use and context for Cambodian Dharma songs in Kampuchea, that is in certain provinces in southern Vietnam, where there are Khmer-speaking communities. Recently, I've been invited to, or have been teaching at the invitation of a Kampuchea temple in San Jose, California, some of these styles that were not transmitted among a particular Khmer diaspora community, but I presume that there are also other styles that continue there. The same goes for Khmer-speaking communities in that I mentioned earlier in the southern portions of northeastern Thailand, particularly in Surin, Sisaket, and Bukit provinces. There are some distinct forms of Dharma songs that are used. Again, different genre terms could be referring to those, but we see, as with many other aspects of Khmer performing arts, a broad continuity between those three major regions where Khmer speakers are found in mainland Southeast Asia. I haven't been able to detect a ton of regional variation within the modern political borders of Cambodia itself, but certainly there's a lot that's been changing over the course of the 20th century. The biggest change is the decline in certain kinds of texts that are very, very long, texts that emphasize doctrinal ideas like aspiration for Buddhahood that are no longer popular among Cambodians today, and other kinds of texts that refer to esoteric meditation traditions that again became increasingly less popular from the middle of the 20th century onward. And so that has changed the textual content, and then also there's a gradual move to focus on shorter texts that best suit the attention span of 21st century Cambodians. Okay, please.
I have a continuation on that question, actually, in terms of contemporary performance. I was really, thank you, first of all, for a wonderful presentation and performance. And I would repeat myself to everyone in the room, but I wholly appreciate the style of critical engagement with performance. I was really struck by how your recitations in English kept continue to use certain vocal techniques, which allowed you to maintain vocal timbres, right? While English uses a different different forms of harmonics that allow us to hear timbres in certain ways. I was wondering then, instead of changing language, changing content, changing size, as you just noted, are there changing aesthetics? So like for younger Cambodians or 21st century Cambodians, are people using like hip hop vocalisms, and different timbres to do that? And then what is that doing within this sort of assembly of different acoustic timbres?
As you know, there's been so much experimentation among younger Cambodian musicians in Cambodia and in diaspora around finding points of intersection and fusion between traditional instruments and vocal styles with more contemporary forms. So that's an ongoing process. It's beginning to really make its mark in my pop music today. I have not yet seen these forms of folklore or smol enter into that realm. And I don't know why. I think it's only a matter of time. Certainly, TikTok is huge among a certain segment of young Cambodian monastics. Videos of various traditional chanting styles are popular in social media as well. Why aren't these aesthetic regimes changing in those senses that we might expect this to happen? Is it something to do with the ways in which these chanting styles are set aside as specifically religious and therefore not combined with other things? And what might be going on here? So, for instance, in a Central Thai context today, there are sermon forms of the Vasantra Jataka that are intended to be specifically comedic, that entail percussion and other instruments as the background, as a sort of that the monks are engaging their chanting in dialogue with this live instrumental music. This is something that has, of course, also deep roots within the Central Thai context, but is also new in some ways. I mean, I haven't seen that kind of experimentation happening in Khmer context, and I'm curious as to why.
So we've probably got time for some one or two more questions. I know there's a number in the chat and there's a number here, so
I'll try to go very quickly if that would be of service. I think, and then, yeah, okay. No, please.
So we saw this popular film, I think from 2003 to 2010, which is a love story that involves a Buddhist chanter.
Yes.
And in the film, it seems that he's also making up, inventing on the spot impromptu songs to respond to the dramatic moments of the film.
Yes.
Is that only in the movies?
No, there are absolutely forms of both, not so much Buddhist chant today, that's a little bit rare, but for other forms of Cambodian music, including what we use represented in the film, that involve this spontaneous, improvised composition of verses. So that's very common, very important and highly valued within the bardic tradition of Cambodia. Why that has become much less common in Buddhist contexts is, again, something that I'm curious about.
Do you have any special comment on that film?
On the film, it's been a really long time since I've seen it, so I don't have any special context, but it does, if I recall, it brings to like the key moment where the young novice, Thum, and Theo, the young woman, fall in love through this, listening to his voice, and sort of it plays with the kind of danger that's, from Buddhist perspective, that's inherent in any kind of aesthetic practices that involve monastics. So I think that it brings up that scene certainly.
So my question is, what happened to these forms during the Khmer Rouge period, and what, how did that impact your ability to learn, subsequent generations? Like, what are the disruptions, disjunctures, changes that were wrought, ways that people kept it alive? I guess I'm more familiar with what happened to dance, and I haven't heard as much about this.
So the three teachers that I studied with most intensively all studied first prior to the Khmer Rouge period and then continued performing afterwards. And none of the three of them were able to use any of these forms at all between 1975 and 1979. One of my teachers, Promut, describes the period immediately after the Khmer Rouge period as one of which he was performing constantly. There was very high demand for him as a chanter, both in terms of performing different kinds of rituals for those who had passed away, monk-school rituals, as well as the kinds of rituals for the end of life for people who were still living at that period. It's also a time in which there was tremendous paper shortages in Cambodia. And so the details of how texts were transmitted in the 1980s, I've been really only able to trace through private notebooks that people, like say they had a 1970s bank calendar, and in that they recorded all of the songs they knew and could remember from before the Khmer Rouge period. There was also a time in which manuscripts were being pulled out of where they were in some cases hid or lost during the Khmer Rouge period, and then recopied onto new forms. So there was both this oral and written reconstruction that was happening during that time. It was also, when it comes to the 90s, old recordings that were held in France and other places in Khmer diaspora were able to be brought back to Cambodia. And so like the most famous Dharma song performer of the 20th century, Malakun, was resurrected in that sense through bringing these recordings back. Thank you. Sure.
I'm sorry to say we are over time now, so we may have to at least formally call things to an end. Please join me, everyone here and on Zoom. Thank you very much. Yes.
And my apologies for not getting to everyone's questions. Feel free to write me if you have additional questions.